I want to move now into covering two applications. We'll talk about LV1 and we'll talk about SuperRack. So these are the two live applications. The third application that we won't talk a lot about today is SoundGrid Studio. We just released a new version of that in the last week or so. And SoundGrid Studio does the exact same thing that we're going to talk about with SuperRack and LV1. It just does it for a studio environment if you're interfacing SoundGrid with the DAW. So we won't go into that a lot today, but if you want more information, obviously there's resources on Waves website, and you can always reach out to me. So I'm going to start with LV1. And first, just kind of establish what LV1 is. Some of you may be familiar with it. It may be a totally new concept to others of you. But LV1 is a software-based mixing platform. So LV1 is a software that can run on any Mac or PC. It is up to a 64-channel mixer. You can have it as 64, 32, or 16 processing channels. Your channels can be mono or stereo. So if you have a 64-channel LV1, you have up to 128 inputs if you're utilizing all your stereo channels. This slide says that we have 16 aux buses. This needs to be updated. We now have 24 auxiliary buses. Those can be mono or stereo as well. We have 8 stereo groups, 8 mono or stereo matrices, 16 DCAs, 8 mute groups, 8 user assignable keys, and 16 custom user banks. So I'll kind of go through a brief demonstration and kind of guide you through what all that looks like here in a second. LV1 is a 32-bit floating point mix engine supporting sample rates up to 96K. And maybe the key selling point is that all of your processing in the console is Waves plugins. So rather than having to interface your processing on an external rack or anything like that, Waves processing, any Waves plugins that you own are available to you natively in LV1. Again, that's still being processed externally on a dedicated DSP server, but all of your channel strip plugins are any Waves plugins that you own. It does include the Emo series plugins, which are the default channel strip that gives you your high and low pass filters. It gives you a dynamics suite, which includes a gate, compressor, leveler, de-esser, and limiter. And then it also gives you a 4-band parametric EQ. All of the Emo series plugins are 0 samples of latency and very efficient DSP-wise. The other cool thing about LV1 is that it is a very modular format. So you can build an LV1 system to fit almost any need, whether that is a large format tour or a fly date or just corporate AV events. So you can run this on any computer. So if that's a laptop with a touchscreen, or if that's an all-in-one Surface, you can do that. If you want to run it on a larger scale, it supports up to 4 screens. So you could have 4 touch screens. It is very touch friendly. It is built with touch in mind, but it's not exclusively touch. So if you want to have physical faders and you want to have tactile control of the console, you can do that. So we support anything that is Mackie or MIDI control protocol. We also have a dedicated surface that will be coming out in July called the Fit controller. So don't be scared away if you are not a touch person. You can definitely still control LV1 with a dedicated control surface. Personally, I like to have a combination of both. I like to have at least a couple touch screens and my controller. It gives you a lot of flexibility in how you actually work. So, but the physical footprint of LV1 can be whatever you dictate as the user. If you want it to be a compact travel system, or if you want to build it out for a permanent install and have all the bells and whistles, it can be configured however you want. So here is a basic setup of what an LV1 configuration would look like. And these are the same 4 components that we addressed at the start. So we have number 1 here, that's our host computer running the LV1 software. Number 2 is showing us our SoundGrid server. So again, that's our DSP engine. The box is labeled 3. Those are our I/O devices. So we've got a local I/O here at front of house, and then we have a couple stagebox I/Os. And then 4 are network switches, tying everything together. So this is a pretty basic setup. Here is a slightly more expanded setup. So in this case, we have a second monitor, we have a control surface here, we have a primary SoundGrid server and a redundant SoundGrid server. We have several IOs, a local IO here in front of house, and then also a few stage IOs. We have a couple network switches tying everything together. And then labeled number 7 down here, we also have an additional computer running the SoundGrid driver that's connected to the network that we're using for multi-track recording and virtual sound check. So I'm going to jump into LV1 now. And we're going to walk through a little bit of a setup here. And I've got a pre-recorded video that I'm going to show you of a demo here. So I'm going to play this video. I'll still be here in the chat in case you guys have any questions as we go. But I'm going to turn off my camera and play the video, and it's going to walk us through the setup here. And then we'll come back and kind of address any questions for you. So here we are looking at the setup page of a blank LV1 session. This is what you see when you first launch the console. And this is where we assign our IO devices and our SoundGrid server and things like that. So you can see right off the bat, we have 2 racks, 2 device racks. We have rack A and rack B. No difference here really. This is just a way for you to keep your devices organized into 2 different slots. So if we click add a device under rack A and go to network devices, we'll see the available devices we have on our network. So I'm going to choose the STG2412, which is a stage rack. And as we assign that, we see that it tells us that this device is using an internal clock source and it's at a sample rate of 48K. And the M indicates that it is the master clock. So by default, the first IO device that we add to a rack becomes the master clock of the LV1 system. Now, if we add a second device here, I'm going to choose the MGB. We can see that it comes on and it tells us SOE, which means sync over Ethernet. So it's deriving its clock source from the master clock, which is the STG2412. Now I can choose a different master clock if I want to, but by default, the first IO device becomes the master. I'm going to come over here to rack B now and add another IO device, but this time I'm going to choose a SoundGrid driver, which is running on a PC computer. So any computer that's running the SoundGrid driver can also be an IO device configured on LV1. And this can be useful for multi-track recording or virtual sound check, or just streaming audio from a DAW for backing tracks and stuff like that. So the driver can be configured to be anywhere between 32 and 128 discrete audio channels. I'm going to choose 32 channels for this example, and we'll stay with that. Now we can also add our SoundGrid server. I have a Extreme server here. And as soon as I add that to the inventory, if you notice up here at the top, our SoundGrid meter now shows us that our SoundGrid network is active, and it gives us a average and peak reading of our DSP usage. The other thing we can do is add a hardware controller. It's worth noting that LV1 is built to be very touch friendly. It is maybe a touch first console, but it's not exclusively a touch console. So if you want to have tactile control over faders and knobs, you can use a control surface with it. We support anything that is Mackie or MIDI control protocol. So I'm going to assign a Mackie control unit here. Waves has a couple options for this that we distribute. There's also plenty of third-party options out there as well. So once we assign the device, we hit the settings button here. I don't have one physically connected here, but I just want to walk through the process and show you. So we would select the device name that's connected here. Typically, those are going to be connected over USB to our host computer. And then we can choose if we want that fader bank to be either a standalone bank or to follow one of our on-screen mixers. So if I choose standalone, that in effect gives me an additional fader bank that I can control independently of my on-screen mixers. Or if I choose to follow mixer 1 or mixer 2, that's going to follow my on-screen mixers wherever I go. So now that we have everything configured here in our inventory, we're going to jump over to the mixer page. If you look across the top here, we have 6 tabs. And this is how we navigate LV1. Everything that you need is in one of these 6 tabs. If we were on multiple screens, we could tear off any one of these tabs and dedicate it to its own screen. So we can have up to 4 screens in LV1 customized from any of these 6 tabs. Now in the mixer window, over here to the left, we have our 8 user-defined keys. And then below that, we have our 8 mute groups. I'll show you how to assign those here shortly. And then to the right-hand side, we have our channel banks. So we can toggle through the different banks here. We have our groups and effects buses, our monitor buses, and then also our masters, which includes our main left-right bus and our matrices. Below that, we have our DCAs. and then we have an overview of the entire console here. We also have 8 customizable layers. So if we choose a custom bank, we have 8 individual custom banks that we can create in each of our 2 mixers. So we have a total of 16 custom banks. And we can populate these from anything. These can be input channels, these can be groups, auxiliary buses, mains, even matrices or DCAs. And you can drag and drop these into place and reorder them however you please after you've created the bank. You can do this on the fly. It doesn't affect audio in LV1 at all, so you can create these after your show is started if you need to. Now here, under where it says modes, we have some options to select different viewpoints for what populates the center section of the console. And the first one is the input mode. And this shows us all of our input assignments and gives us control over our preamp gain and our phantom power. So you can see I've got channel 1 already assigned to mic input 1 here. I'm going to go ahead and assign channel 2 as well. I'm going to choose the 2412 mic input 2. You can see now we have our gain control, phantom power, we have our polarity, and our trim controls. Now below the input, we have our rack view. This shows us our 8 insert points on every channel. This is for inputs and outputs. By default, we have the Emo series plugins loaded. This gives us a high and low pass filter. This gives us dynamics control and a parametric EQ. Now the Emo series plugins are 0 samples of latency. They're very low DSP usage. So these are the default channel strip that come with the console and that load on all your channels when you open a new session. Below that, we have the dynamics and EQ view, and this gives us a condensed overview of the Emo series plugins. So we can see our filters and our dynamics control. We can turn those on and off. It gives us gain reduction feedback, and then it also shows us our EQ curve. Below that view, we have our auxiliary buses. So we have our effects 1 through 8, monitors 1 through 8, and monitors 9 through 16. So we have a total of 24 auxiliary buses that can be mono or stereo. And to send level, you just grab the slider above the channel and you can send level to any of your mix buses. Also, if you select the auxiliary name to the left-hand side here, it goes to sends on fader mode, which routes the auxiliary send level to the channel fader. So you can quickly go through your mix buses and create a mix. So this is a great mode to work in if you're doing a monitor mix. Now you notice the auxiliary buses are labeled effects 1 through 8, monitors 1 through 8, and monitors 9 through 16. We can borrow from either of these banks for additional channels. So if we need to have more effects buses, we can pull from the monitor banks. If we need additional monitor buses, we can pull from the effects bank. Below that, we have the routing view, and this shows us all of our channel assignments within the console. So this shows us our A and B input selection. It shows us our group and matrix assignments, and then it shows us our output assignments as well as our direct outs. Below that, we have the channel view, and this is great if you're working on a single screen like I am here. This shows you everything about your channel in one screen with the mixer. So whatever channel we select in the mixer, it's going to give us a full overview of that channel in this view. So this shows us our input and gain assignments. It shows us our plugin rack, our plugin overview, then it shows us our auxiliary buses and our output assignments. Now, if we click the little arrow here, this will take us over to another bank of modes. The first one is the Dugan Auto Mixer. Dugan does require an additional license to go with LV1, but it is built into the console already. So once you have that license, you have 64 channels of Dugan auto mixing that you can activate as needed. And this is great if you're doing any kind of corporate AV, talking head event, a really great auto mixer. Below that, again, we have the rack, the dynamics and EQ views. And then we have our auxiliary views again, but these are the expanded auxiliary views. It shows us 16 buses at a time instead of 8 buses at a time. So we have our effects buses and monitors 1 through 8, and we have all 16 monitor buses, and then we have effects 1 through 8, and then monitors 9 through 16. And again, if we select over here to the left, it routes those to sends on fader mode. Now quickly, I want to show you how the patch bay mirrors what we see here in our routing view. So I'm going to jump over to the patch bay. And here we have our input patches. And you can see I've already assigned input 1 and 2 to come from the STG2412. So real quick, I'm just going to assign the rest of those one-to-one coming from our stagebox. And that's routing to input A. And you can see here we have all of our channel names. We can rename our channels really easily here. We can also convert our channels between mono and stereo channels by double-clicking over here to the right. Now, our B input can be used for virtual sound check or to toggle from another input. In this case, I'm going to use it for a virtual sound check. So my B input, I want a route to come from my Axis 1 driver. So this is a DAW that I have running with some pre-recorded tracks. So I'm going to select that. I'm going to hide my 2412. Then I'm just going to patch the outputs of the DAW to come to my channel inputs. Now, the other thing to show you here is our output assignments. We have all of our direct outputs and our mixed bus outputs. So while I'm here, I'm going to go ahead and assign the output of our main left-right bus. And I want that to go to our 2412. And that's going to go to outputs 1 and 2, and I've already got it assigned here. Now, if I go to my internal tab, this shows us all of our console assignments. So again, in the mixer view, if we look here, we have all of our group and matrix assignments. Now, if I go to the patch bay, I have all that same stuff here. And this is really a great place to do it when you're initially setting up your session. So we can quickly assign things to groups. We can assign things to matrices. We can create DCAs very quickly. So I'm going to assign channels 1 through 8 to DCA 1, 9 through 16 for DCA 2. We'll just do a couple channels here for 3 and 4. And we can also do our mute groups. Now, since I just set up my inputs, my B input to come from my DAW, I want to set the console up to flip between my A and B. So I'm going to go back to my setup tab and go under UI settings. And here's where I can assign my user function keys. So I've got 8 user keys that I can assign. And there's a pretty comprehensive list here of some common functions. And one of those is flip AB input channel. So if I go back to my mixer, I can see my user key here, number 1, is already assigned to flip AB. And if I hit that, you'll see all my channels flip to the B input, and I should see some inputs coming from my DAW now. So now that I've got some signal coming through, I'm just going to bring up some faders. And bring up my master. So now I've got full signal flow in the console. I've got my inputs assigned, my outputs are routed to a physical socket on my I/O rack, and I've got signal coming through my channels and going out to my master bus. Now I'm going to jump over to the channel overview tab. Now in the channel overview, we can see everything about our channel, including our input racks, our plugin rack, our plugin overview, our auxiliary buses, and our output assignments. So the plugin rack, this is where we can bring all of our plugins into focus and see all of our individual processors. These can be dragged and dropped, reordered into place, however you like. This does not cause LV1 to drop audio. If I click the drop-down menu here, I'll see all the plugins that I have available here. So any Waves plugins that you own the license for, you can drop into any of your racks. The other thing it shows us here is our latency, both for the plugin and for the rack. So we can see we've got 0 samples of latency on this individual plugin. We also have 0 samples of latency in our rack. Now, if we go to the top here, we have a preset menu, and Waves actually has some built-in presets ready to go for you, so you can quickly load a starting point for your channel. If you don't own the license to one of the plugins included in the preset, that plugin will just be inactive. Now here at the main section of the channel overview, we have our plugin overview where we can see and control all the Emo series plugins. Also, any parameter that you select in this section will map to this slider down here at the bottom, which gives you fine-tuned control. Also, if you're on touchscreen, it's kind of nice to have a slider as opposed to trying to work the knobs. And then to the right, we have our auxiliary buses, again, in banks of 8. We have effects 1 through 8, monitors 1 through 8, and monitors 9 through 16. Now, all of our auxiliary buses we can choose the source point individually per bus, per channel. So I have the option to choose the auxiliary source point from the input, which means no processing. I can make it pre-fader, post-fader, or post-pan. So I'm just going to send some level to effects bus 1 from this channel. I'll do that off the input, and then I'll also do monitor 1 through 8 on monitor 1. I'm actually going to flip this effects bus to post-fade. So, and then again, I've got my output assignments over here to the right if I want to change any DCA assignments or group assignments. Now, if I jump back to the mixer, I'm going to go down here to my groups and effects layers. You can see I've got some audio assigned to group 1. My group buses can be used as subgroups or as parallel buses. So if I go to my routing tab, I can either assign or unassign that group from the master bus. So if I want to use it as a parallel bus, everything is time aligned. I can use it for parallel compression. So I can come to my rack and insert. We'll do an SSL compressor here. So now I've got some parallel compression going on that bus. Now, if I want to use it as a subgroup, all I have to do is come back to my channels and unassign the channels from the master bus. Now we only hear those channels through the subgroup. But I like to use it as parallel. Now here we have our auxiliary buses. So we have our 8 return channels, and we can flip these between mono or stereo. And then we can insert an effect directly here in the return rack. So this workflow is more similar to a DAW, where you have a send from the channel and then you have a return bus that you insert your effect directly on. And then the next page, we have our monitors. Again, these can be mono or stereo. And we have 16 monitor buses here. And we have a full rack on the monitor output bus, so we can affect EQ and compression and stuff going to specific mixes. Now on our masters bus, again, we have our main left-right channel, then we have our center and mono channels, we have our Q and talk back, and then we have our 8 matrices. Now our matrices can be, again, mono or stereo, and each matrix has a 12 input mixer. And the inputs for the matrix can be chosen from any channel inputs, groups, auxiliary buses, our mains, center, and mono channels. And we can also choose the source point. So we can choose it directly off the input with no processing, pre-fader, post-fader, or post-pan, which makes it a stereo input. So the last thing to talk about is going to be our DCAs. So if I go back to the patch bay, I just want to recap here that we assigned some channels to some DCAs here, which are labeled link groups in the patch bay. So we have channels 1 through 8 going to DCA 1, then 9 through 16 going to DCA 2, and then 3 and 4. So if I go back to my mixer, look at my DCA channels, you can see I've got my 16 DCAs here. So I'm just going to grab DCA 1 and pull it down. Now, if I look at my channel bank, you can see that I've got a ghost fader showing on the channels now. And that's showing me the relative difference between the DCA contribution to the master bus and where my actual channel faders are. Now, I can't control the level of the channel from the ghost fader. That's just showing me the relationship between my input channel and my DCA. Now, my DCAs also have 2 underlying functions, and that is the link groups and the spill groups. So if I look in here at the upper left-hand corner, first I have a link group assignment, so I can choose any one of my 16 DCAs as a link group. Currently, I'm chosen on link group 1, and I can activate the link group by clicking the link button here. Now you can see when I do that, each channel is highlighted orange, showing that it is part of link group 1. And what that does is links all the global parameters between those channels. So now my fader, my relative fader levels are linked. My pan levels are linked. My gains are linked. Any parameter that is global between all of those channels, those are linked once we activate the link group. We only have one active link group at a time. So if I wanted to affect link group 2, I would manually go and select link 2. Now you can see these channels are linked. Now the other function is the spill group. So if I deactivate the link and turn on the spill group, it populates the fader bay with all of the channels that contribute to that DCA. So I've got my DCA fader here, and then all of the channels that are assigned to that DCA fill the fader bay. Now I can manually change which group is spilled in the mixer, or if I'm working with multiple screens or have a control surface, if one of my two screens is set to my DCA bank, or if my control surface is in standalone mode on my DCAs, whatever DCA I select on one of those will automatically populate the other mixer that's assigned to spill mode with those faders. So it's kind of like working with Midas Pro Series pop groups, if you're familiar with that workflow. One last thing to show you in the patch bay is our device-to-device patching. And this gives us a digital split of all of our devices. So all of our inputs and all of our outputs, we can actually route any device input to any device output. And that's totally independent of the console itself. So that's independent of any of our processing or any of our routing within LV1. So for example, if I want to set up my multi-track record feed, I'm going to come from my stage rack, my 2412, and I want that to go to my DAW, which is the Axis 1. So I can quickly just create a patch for those channels. And this is essentially a digital split that is a mult patch. We've got our stage rack inputs already going to LV1 channel inputs, and now we've multed those over to our DAW as well. Now for my DAW returns, I've already patched those to the B inputs on my channels for virtual sound check. But let's say, for example, I want to send that to another console so they can also do virtual sound check there. I can send that to my MGB, which is a MADI interface. Let's say I've got a second console that has a MADI input that I've got routed from this. I can assign the outputs of my DAW to go to that MADI interface really quickly. So now my playback is going both to the B inputs of my channels in LV1, and it's being routed out to another console via my MADI interface. Okay, so that's kind of the complete overview of LV1, pretty comprehensive demo and walkthrough there. I'd like to do some questions, maybe some Q&A before we move on to SuperRack. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to throw them in the chats there. If you guys are in Zoom, you can throw them in the chat. If you're on Facebook or YouTube, the same thing, and Nick will relay those to me. While we're waiting to see if some of those come in, Nick, if you're able to chime in here, I just kind of wanted to ask you about some of your experience. I know that you have an LV1 system. You've been a user for a while. So I just kind of wanted to get maybe your impression of using the mixer and just generally your impression of how it sounds, how you like to use it, what applications it works well for. I think there we go.
Excellent. Yeah, definitely jumping into LV1 makes a huge difference in the workflow. Usually to me, the main advantage would be to have the same sound as on the studio. Whatever configuration with all the plugins that you play or recorded, you can use it now live. So that give you unlimited options. You have tons of different plugins that will emulate so many devices, and probably it's a more complete option than many consoles out there have the advantage to incorporate so many modeled devices. And I think one of the features that I like the most is obviously the delay compensation of all the sources, meaning that everybody's arriving at the same time to the master buses, and that makes a huge difference as far as the sound. It sounds very tight as far as sound goes. It's a great canvas. You can start with one monitor or run it through your computer. So that makes it pretty nice rig to travel or to move around, or for venues that have very small space to set up a console. So you can just take it with you as a small briefcase and have all your devices. Another advantage is the difference of IOs devices that you have available. So I can place IOs in the specific areas that I need to without having a massive rack and just running a data network cable, and I'm good to go. And sharing my inputs with other devices and multi-recording makes really a great tool. And working offline, you can pre-program your show from your computer. There's loading the file. It's many advantages that I see on LB1.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's one of the things that we didn't really cover is the I/O sharing. We do support the ability to have up to 3 LB1 consoles on a network, and I/O can be shared between those systems simultaneously. So if we have front of house monitors and broadcast all running simultaneously, they can all look at the same stage rack. One of those devices would become the manager of the preamps, and the other devices or the other mixers would have digital virtual gain with gain compensation. So if the manager makes any adjustments to the analog preamp, it'll automatically compensate for that to maintain consistent gain structure in the other consoles as well. Let's see, there's a question here in the chat I want to address. Could the system be controlled from 2 places? So technically, yes. So it depends on the setup, but LV1 has 2 mixers. So if you look here, we've got mixer 1 and mixer 2. You can split these out to different screens. So any of these 6 tabs across the top, you can dedicate to another screen. So technically you could have mixer 2 on a KVM or something like that and switched over to another screen that could be controlled in another spot. But even more simply than that, maybe, is the ability to use a remote desktop application like TeamViewer or something like that. LV1 is just a application running on a operating system. So the system you're seeing here is a Windows configuration. It could also run on Mac. So you can control that from any kind of remote desktop application over a Wi-Fi network or anything like that. There are also some applications that we're seeing right now, particularly with all the COVID-19 stuff going on, where we're seeing LV1s being used on location for remote broadcast, and they're being controlled, and the mix is being operated from a remote user, on the other side of the country, who's able to remote in and control the mix just over the internet. So one of the applications we're seeing right now, one of the U.S. presidential candidates has an LB1 system that they're using to do all of their live TV events, and that is being mixed from an operator in the middle of Iowa somewhere, and they're just remoted into the studio on location and mixing the LB1 from there. So you have a lot of applications where doing that is really cool. And even right down to tech support, if you are an integrator or you have a team that you're sending out with an LV1 system, it's really easy for you to remote into the system and do troubleshooting remotely as well. Any other questions you guys want to address about LV1? Anybody chiming in on Facebook or YouTube, Nick?
No, so far we're good.
Okay. Cool. We can definitely come back if any questions come up in the next few minutes. We'll have some more Q&A time after this next little segment. So the next thing I want to cover is the application SuperRack. SuperRack is very similar to LV1 in all the functionality. We looked at how to add I/O devices. We looked at how to do patching and how to do processing, and just kind of how the general layout and navigation works. And SuperRack is very similar, but it is a different application for a different use case. So LV1 is a dedicated mixer. We have a full mixing with processing rack, DCAs and everything. Whereas SuperRack, you can think of more as a virtual outboard rack if you're already using a digital console. So say if you have a Digico or Yamaha or an S6L or whatever. Well, actually S6L, bad example. That's the one that doesn't apply here. But if you have Yamaha, Digico, Allen and Heath, whatever, you can think of SuperRack as a virtual outboard rack that allows you to run Waves processing with that console. One question to address before I move on. The BPM feature dedicated in LV1. So while this is still up on the screen, up here in the upper part of the toolbar, there's a flash in BPM with a tap tempo. That is our global tap tempo control. So any plugin that we insert, I'll just walk through this real quick. So say if we throw in a delay here, we'll throw in the H delay. And if I open that up, there's an option here to set it to its own BPM or to the host. And if I set it to host, it will automatically follow whatever the global tap tempo for LV1 is. So any plugin that has a tempo feature that can be assigned to host will follow your global tap tempo up here. Thanks for that question. All right, so I'm gonna move on and show you SuperRack. I'm just gonna clear out some of this so I can use it for the next demo. All right, so here's our SuperRack interface. And right off the bat, you can see it's pretty similar to LV1. You know, we've got the 6 tabs across the top. We've got our setup, patch bay, our show, which is our automation. We have our rack view, and then we have 2 overviews. So again, any 6 of these tabs can be torn off and create its own floating window, so you can dedicate it to its own screen. You can have up to 4 screens customized however you want. So kind of the same walkthrough here. You know, we'll add an I/O device. I'm going to choose the MGB here. So this will simulate a MADI I/O coming to and from a console like an SSL or a Soundcraft or something like that. So again, we see the M here indicating that this is the master clock and that it shows a sample rate of 48K, currently showing internal clock source. If this was a real world application, we would probably set that to either a word clock input or MADI input for the clocking to come from the console. We could add a SoundGrid driver. Let me actually release that from LB1. Check, check, still here. All right, so we can now add SoundGrid driver, and then we can also add SoundGrid server. At the bottom here, there's a section for adding a controller here. So you can use any MIDI controller to control some of the functions in SuperRack. So that could just be like a USB MIDI controller connected to your host computer. And this mapping software lets you map any MIDI parameter to these functions within SuperRack. So that could be for recalling snapshots, for opening up individual plugins that you set to your hot plugins, or controlling plugin or parameters within your plugins as well. The other thing here in the setup tab under settings, this is where you would just kind of configure your basic setup for SuperRack. So if you had used multi-rack previously, SuperRack has essentially replaced multi-rack functionally. But multi-rack allows you to add individual racks. So if you're used to that workflow, that's one thing that's changed to SuperRack. Now you select a configuration. So you have 4 racks, 8 racks, 16, 32, or 64. Now, again, your racks can be mono, stereo, multi-channel, 5.1, 7.1. Your racks can be configured with however many audio paths you desire, up to 64 racks and up to 128 total audio paths. The other thing to look at here is the latency alignment. If you want to align by latency groups, or if you want to align all of your racks manually, automatically, I mean. I'll come back and show you that when I get to the patch bay. I'll show you what the latency groups look like. But essentially what that means is when you insert a channel from your console, let's say you're using a Digico and you insert your snare top and your snare bottom to run through SuperRack, and then you insert different processing chains on those 2 channels, you may be inserting different amounts of latency because the plugins have different latency in them based on what you're adding. So the latency alignment makes sure that everything that you group together is timed back to return to the console with the same phase relationship that it left the console with. So you're not going to screw up any of your phasing in SuperRack. So there's 2 different ways to align that. And then over here to the right, you have your user assignable keys. So there's a comprehensive list of functions here that you can select to choose what you want your user-defined keys to be. So after you configure your I/O devices, you can come over here to the overview. And this is similar to the mixer view in LV1. And same thing, we have two overview tabs here. And these are showing you the same thing. You can just dedicate two different simultaneous views. So overview 1 could be bank 1 through 16, while overview 2 is showing you a custom layer. So you have 4 custom layers in each of your overview, so a total of 8 custom layers here. You also have a full overview that shows us all of our racks simultaneously. At the top, you've got your input patch, which we can assign. So we'll choose MADI input 1. And you can see it automatically assigns the output patch for us as well. So that is now a send and return from our console. And then we have our 8 insert points here where we can insert our processing. Now you'll notice that on the input and output, we have an A and a B toggle here. So this allows you to toggle between 2 different input and output, or input sources and output destinations. So say if you're using SuperRack in a festival situation and you have 2 different consoles set up for 2 different bands, but you want both of those to be able to run through SuperRack, you can quickly toggle your A and B inputs and have both of those consoles patched simultaneously. The other thing here over to the right, we have our hot plugins. So we can assign plugins to the hot plugins list here. Let's see, we'll set this to hot plugin number 1. And so you see that shows up here now. So now when we select that, it'll automatically bring that plugin into focus for us. So we can have up to 12 hot plugins ready to go there. You can also float out the hot plugins list. So we can pop it out and tack it to the surface here. We can change the orientation. So now that stays on our work surface. No matter what page we go to, our hot plugins is always on top. We can also have a whole screen dedicated just to the floating window like that. Same thing with our user keys. We can expand that list out, tack it to the surface, and have that stay on top. Similar to LV1, we do have the Dugan Auto Mixer built into SuperRack. So again, this does require the additional license, but with that license, you have 64 channels of Dugan Auto Mixer ready to go in SuperRack. Moving on to the rack view. So this shows us all of our plugin focus controls, as well as focusing on our plugin rack. You can load your individual plugins here. Just throw some different stuff in here. Same deal, you can drag and drop these, reorder them however you like. There are also built-in presets. So if you go to factory presets, you can find a starting point. So say if you're working on your kick drum, you just need a quick starting point, you can recall that factory preset and it'll load it up for you. If you don't own the license for any plugins included in the preset, it'll just disable that one plugin. Some other important information that shows here in the rack view is over here on the left, it shows us the rack latency. So you can see right now we have 0 samples of latency on this rack. If we click the drop-down menu within each of the plugins, we see that same thing. So we see the individual plugin latency, 0 samples, and also the overall rack latency, 0 samples. So if we threw in something, I'll go drastic here, and let's insert the linear multiband. So now we see that has added 3,840 samples of latency to our mix here. So this is not your go-to for your in-ears. But just for the example, we can see still the D5 shows us that it has 0 samples of latency, but the overall rack latency is 80 milliseconds because of that linear multiband. So let's get rid of that guy. The plugin overview, this is where you can control your individual parameters. There's a touch and slide over here to the right. So any parameter that you select in this view will map to the touch and slide over here to the right. Also, your plugins can be used to create floating windows. So we can hit the little button up here at the top, and tack that, and now we can move our plugins around and keep those on the surface as well. So if you were a multi-rack user, this is great news for you. Being able to see multiple plugins at a time and have a whole screen dedicated just to the plugins that you want to see. Now in the show window under your snapshots, you can actually also create snapshots to include the window arrangement. So if you have different scenes that you want to see different plugins open on, when you create a snapshot, you can tell it to include that plugin window arrangement, which is cool. And that's also true in LV1. So everything in the show tab is pretty much identical to what we looked at in LB1, so I'm not going to spend any time there. I'm going to move on to the patch bay. And three things to look at here. So we have our device-to-device patching. So again, if we're doing multi-track recording and virtual sound check, this allows us to route audio between any two devices. So I can send my MADI inputs going directly to my SoundGrid driver that I'm using for virtual or for multi-track recording. In addition to that, I've got my latency groups. So if I choose to have the console do alignment by latency groups, this is where I set that up. So I can choose what channels I want to maintain in a latency relationship with. So anything that I want to maintain phase relationship from the console, say if it's all my drums or if it's if I'm stereo micing a guitar, or if I've got choir mics or audience mics or anything like that that I want to keep grouped together, I would assign those to a latency group, and I can rename those groups. This can be my drums. And then I can tell it to automatically align all those channels, or I can manually type in how much latency I want to time those back to. And I can do that based on samples, milliseconds, feet, or meters. So if I jump back to, let's just go back to one of these channels here. I'll throw that linear multiband in again. Latency overflow. So let's just do an L2 that's got a couple of samples here. Okay, so I've exceeded the maximum latency alignment here. Let's just remove those. Well, I'm not sure what I've done there. Try a different channel real quick. Okay, I'm not sure what I've done. Sorry about that. But the concept here is that anytime you align your channels, it's going to look at the channel with the most latent path, and it's going to time that back to be automatically phase aligned when it returns to the console. So in addition to your latency groups, you've got link groups. Your link groups allow you to group global parameters within a set of channels. So if I create a link group for these first racks here, what that does is now links the common parameters. So my inputs and outputs, my A and B toggle, my input trim, my output trim, all those common parameters are now linked in the link group. So just to give you kind of a visual representation here of what a SuperRack setup would look like. So this is showing us a pretty basic setup with a Digico console. Digico, for the most part, includes the Waves I/O card on all the SD consoles as standard, or at least optional. So that I/O card is how we're getting audio from the console into SuperRack and back. That hits a network switch where we have a SuperRack host where we're doing all of our control, and then a SoundGrid server, and then a SoundGrid redundant server. So this is pretty common setup, would be true for most consoles. Just swap out the console and I/O card for whatever platform you're in. This is another example where instead of using a dedicated I/O card, we would use a MADI interface. So this could hold true for MADI, Dante, or AVB. So any protocol that does not have a dedicated SoundGrid interface on the console, you can jump to one of these standard protocols and bring that into SoundGrid this way. You'll notice that this one shows SuperRack and our DAW running on the same computer. That's a question we get asked a lot, is can you run your multi-track recording and virtual sound check on the same computer? The answer technically is yes. As long as you trust your computer with that amount of processing. Again, SuperRack is not putting a load on your computer or not much of a load on your computer. That's all being handled externally on your SoundGrid server. As a matter of best practices, I would suggest doing it on separate computers whenever possible. But there's no technical limitation as far as SuperRack or SoundGrid is concerned. You can run them on the same computer. All right, so any questions about SuperRack? It's pretty straightforward, but if there's any specific application questions, and Nick, I'll throw it to you again if you want to chime in. If there's any cases where you've used SuperRack and just kind of what your experience has been, how the integration works with different console platforms and everything. I know you guys see a lot of it in your rental business.
Well, obviously with SuperRack, the idea is to set up multiple systems to route for recording. We've been using it a couple of times. Obviously with the new release, we still gotta play with it. But for example, I have a question here. Says, if you had to switch between bands on a live show, but you need to keep, let's say, DJ or MC channel up, what will be the best scenario on the LV1?
Sure. So in LV1 specifically?
Well, in LV1 or a SuperRack.
Yeah, so it'd be pretty much the same in either one. And there's two ways that you could do it. Let me jump to LV1 and I'll show you there. So I showed you here how I set up the flip AB here. So I've got my virtual inputs and I've got my stage rack inputs here. And I'm just using that to toggle between A and B. So what I could potentially do is if I've got two different bands, I've got maybe two stages and each has their own stage rack, and I've got a certain set of inputs patched to A and then another set of inputs patched to B. Whatever channel is my MC channel, let's say channel 16 is my MC, I could do a couple things. I could dummy proof it by making my B input the same input as my A. So when I flip the whole console, if I accidentally flip that channel 2, it's just going to mirror that same input. I could also go to my recall safe and I could recall safe that individual channel input. So that way it's not going to affect the A and B toggle for channel 16. The other thing I could do is just create a snapshot that changes every channel except for that one channel. So I have a few options of how I could actually set that up, and it'd be the same in SuperRack. You would do, you could set your B input of one channel to mirror the same as the A input. You could recall safe that rack in your setup for your snapshot, or you could just create a snapshot that changes everything over except that one channel. Hopefully that answers the question there. Anybody else have a question over on your end, Nick?
I think we're good so far. I don't know if anybody else from the Zoom connection has a question.
Yeah, if you're in Zoom, I'm going to allow you to unmute yourself. So if you want to ask a question, feel free to unmute your mic and you can ask audibly, or if you want to use the chat, do that as well. We'll hold for a couple minutes, and if we don't have any other questions, we can wrap up. But while we wait to see if there's more questions, I wanted to go ahead and point out a couple things. So, Nick has worked hard and very graciously kind of set this up for us to be able to do this training. So first of all, I want to thank him for kind of advertising it and getting the word out about it. And he's also arranged for everybody who is watching today to receive a voucher from Waves. So make sure that you email Nick or send him a message on Facebook or whatever avenue you want to get in touch with him. And just make sure that he has your email address. And once we have all those collected, I'll provide some vouchers for him to send out to you guys. We are already doing a 40% off promotion. And we're also doing with that free plugins if you spend certain dollar amounts. So combine that with the voucher that we'll apply. You guys have a lot of ammunition to go and get some new toys and some new tools to play with. So thanks again, Nick, for setting this all up. And everyone make sure, and if you're here, make sure that Nick has your email address so we can get you that voucher. And we'll give you guys just a couple more minutes in case you want to ask any questions. I'm also going to throw my email address here in the Zoom chat. And then Nick, if you want to send that out on your end.
Excellent. Yes, definitely we're going to send those vouchers out to everybody that is sharing this evening with us. And also want to let you know we have a full LV1 rig, 64 channels here at the office. I guess we can arrange sessions if you guys want to come in, have a hands-on and listen to it and play with it. On this way you get more familiar with the interface and all the options that you have with LV1.
Cool. Yeah, that's great. What all do you have in the setup for the LV1 that you have there, Nick? What IOs and interfaces?
Well, we're using the SoundGrid from DSP Pro, and obviously we have icons, so we have touch screens, 2 extreme servers connected to it, and that will give you all the options to understand how the system works.
Cool.
We can connect it to other consoles as well, running multi-track. You can listen from this console to another and compare sound quality, latency, and all the other features.
Great. Cool. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, if you're in the Miami area or anywhere within a couple hours drive, that definitely is a great resource to have. Thanks for throwing that out there, Nick. Another question here in the chat on Zoom says, can you save channel presets from one live set to be available for use later on? Yes. So if you look, and this is true for LV1 or for SuperRack, all of the presets are cross-compatible. So if you create a preset in SuperRack, you can recall that same preset in LV1 and vice versa. And that's going to be true for the plugins and for the rack. So in the individual plugin, if you save a preset, you can save it to your preset menu, or you can save it to a new file if you want to just put that preset on a thumb drive to be used on a different system. And you can also do that in the rack as well. So if you come down to the drop-down menu here, you can save your preset or save it to a file. And that's going to, if you save the preset, that'll put it here in your menu. So when you go to user presets, you'll see a list of all your saved presets. Or if you do save to file, you can put it to a thumb drive or email that file to someone who wants your settings or whatever. So yeah, all the preset management is really, really easy to use, and it makes it really easy to be able to interchange your presets with other users and other platforms as well.
Excellent. We got another question from David. He's asking, what's the difference between LV1 and the new Studio Rack?
Sure. So the new Studio Rack is based on LV1. It's a similar layout. You've got a mixer, you've got your plugin instances. It's a little more limited in the mixer, so you don't have things like your group channels and all your DCAs and stuff like that are in LV1. So the layout's slightly different. And then also in SoundGrid Studio, you've got a monitor section. So it's really designed for a workflow with a DAW. So if you're using it to do multi-track recording and overdubs and offloading processing for Waves plugins from a DAW, you would want to use SoundGrid Studio. If you're doing a live show, you would want to use LV1. So, but they're very similar, just different layouts, different limitations, and different strengths for sure. One of the cool things in SoundGrid Studio is that you actually have pass-through controls to your DAW. So if you have SoundGrid Studio up in front of Pro Tools, all of your Pro Tools shortcut commands will still work, even though Pro Tools isn't in the foreground. So yeah, that one's really designed for using with a DAW interface.
Excellent. So I think that's pretty much it. I don't know if anybody else wants to jump in with another question. If not, we can wrap this up.
Sure.
Okay, I guess thank you guys for joining us, and hopefully we can do this again. And stay safe. Hopefully we can get back together on the stages pretty soon.
Yeah, it'd be nice when all of us can get back to gigging and earning money and being out there making music. So thanks to you guys for tuning in, and thanks Nick for having us today. Really appreciate it.
And thank you, Jeremiah. That was awesome. Hopefully we can do this pretty soon again.
Sure. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, guys.
Cheers.